Even with the conclusion to the writer's strike and the possible conclusion to the actor's strike, Severance Season 2 seems like it still might be far off, and I've been kind of going crazy over this show and its weirdness. I mean, there's so many weird things in that show, and they're so hard to explain that I'm gotta try, you know? I've been losing sleep, so I gotta try to sleep. I have 4 theories, and they're probably all wackier than you would expect, and they're all references to music to try and preserve the mystery of them up until we get to them, and maybe you can predict and guess, so let's do it. Okay, I may have lied about this one specifically. It's kinda exactly what it is, but it was too good not to use. The main idea behind this theory is that the Civil War, in one way or another, is very important to the lore of Lumen. The main piece of evidence that turned me onto this idea was the fact that Lumen was founded in 1865. Now that is exactly when the Civil War ended, and Kier was only 20 when he started the company. So there's a pretty good chance he served. The fact that the Civil War isn't mentioned at all, and it is very clear that the company was founded in its wake, only lends more suspicion. I mean, if they just brought it up once, even as a small thing, that would be way less suspicious than never bringing it up. This idea gives more explanation and context to the Kier statue found within town. The quote on it basically says that war comes from within, and that would fit really well with both the theme of the show and this theory. In the exact same scene this statue is in, there is people from the Whole Mind Collective, which is basically abolitionists. I mean, it literally says that on their thing, that they want to abolish severance. So, there's more parallels than just this statue. The last thing that I want to mention for this theory is that the coup and the paintings about the coup are kind of reminiscent of a civil conflict. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but that painting is somewhat close to Sherman burning Atlanta, just a little bit. This theory is about the black tar substance seen throughout the show, both through the intro and Irving's hallucinations/dreams. The main thing about this theory is that it goes way beyond just being his paint. If it was meant to represent just Irving's paint, I do not think it would be in the intro as much as it is. It's too omnipresent both in the intro and as a idea that it would have to be something more. If I were to make a guess as to what this is, I would guess it's a precursor to the Severance chip, like a drug version of what the Severance procedure does, and it could go all the way back to the very beginning of Lumen. To me, this would explain why the cult-like atmosphere at Lumen is so old feeling compared to how young the Severance chip is. Maybe this feeling has only existed for a few decades, but I feel like it's existed longer than that, and this would lend credence to that theory. This would also fit with the previous theory, as a drug that makes you forget would be quite useful after serving in a very traumatic war, both the war itself and everything surrounding it, so that would be quite profitable. This might explain why the Civil War wasn't mentioned at all in the show, as the drug would make you forget everything about it, and suddenly no war even happened to anyone. Lastly, this would explain why Audie Irving repeatedly paints the testing floor, since he may have been reset with the drug and the chips don't have the functionality that the drug does. Okay, we have truly entered the wacky zone with this theory. It's definitely weirder than the previous two, because the previous two I think most people would be like, yeah, I could see it, even if they don't agree. This one's wacky, so let's just do it. Also, I'm gonna assume that Lumen is capable of cloning in this show, just because it's already a real thing in real life, and I don't want to have to spend time explaining why they might be doing that. The crux of this theory is that Mark is clearly more special than the other characters, and not just because he's the protagonist. Mark is definitely a priority for Lumen, since his housing is subsidized by them, and Cobell lives right next to him. Also, when Petey got fired, competence and seniority was passed over for Mark. When Mark's glass cube was brought up, it was implied that it was just given to him, without him earning it, which would reinforce the idea that he's special compared to the other people on his floor. It is also important to note that Mark's break room experience is not shown at all, although we do know he has bruises on his hands from it, which might mean it's different than the other characters. I think the reason that Mark is treated so special is because he's a clone of Kier, and they're trying to recreate him, not just biologically, but with his life experience. Even though both Mark and Kier work very different lives, they both met their wives at work. This may explain why Kier discourages workplace relationships even though he himself had one. Maybe his wife died and the reason it's discouraged is because he wasn't able to work the same way again. This is exactly what happens to Mark, as when Gemma dies, he's not able to work again. There is also this Kier quote, and Devin says this in the last episode.
She was just still in your veins, you know?
People have already pointed out how Mark's narration to himself about how he liked his wife equally in all aspects is similar to the wellness session, but it could be even deeper than that, because Irving says this earlier in the show.
What's your favorite?
All mine.
Which would point to a sort of ideological pairing between Mark and Kier. This is definitely a loose thing that I'm going to bring up now, but Mark and Kier and Gemma and Imogene do kind of seem very similar names. They're not the same, and this could just be anything, but it's weird that they're that similar. This is probably the best theory to give the intro the time it deserves and the explanation it deserves. Probably the most important thing about the intro is that it isn't just about duality, but also duplicity. We don't just see two Marks, we see a sea of Marks. In the end, if you're trying to recreate something as complex as a person, you'd want as many attempts as you can get, so that fits with the duplication that is seen in the intro. Lastly, for this part of the theory, Milchek says this.
I love seeing the sunrise on his face.
And this relates really well to the fact that multiple times in the intro, Mark's face is shown with sunlight pouring down on it. This explains a lot of the oddities of Cobell, as her obsession with Mark and all the weirdness of her makes a lot more sense when the person she's idolizing is literally living right next to her. In the end, it would explain why Cobell both admires Mark for the great things he says and does, but also treats him like a child that's undeveloped, because to her, he is. Cobell also says this.
The light of discovery shines truer upon a virgin meadow than a beaten path.
Which implies that the situation with Mark and Gemma has happened a few times before. I have seen people point out the importance of recycling in this show, but I haven't seen as many people point out the importance of water. A very large portion of the paintings and photos in the show are of water, in one way or another. Lakes, clouds, and rivers. Part of the opening line for newly severed employees is right as rain. Dylan's theory about the numbers is that it has to do with the ocean, and even if that's not true, the fact that he jumped to the ocean is important. Also, it seems that Kier, Pennsylvania is in a permanent winter situation, which would fit with the water theme. My thinking is that, in line with the themes of recycling and water, Lumen has brought humanity back from some sort of catastrophic or possibly apocalyptic event that was probably ecological. This would explain the prevailing emptiness found throughout the world. The severed floor is not using space effectively at all. Not just that, but Kier, Pennsylvania seems particularly empty as well. The housing development Mark lives in is empty except for Cobell and himself. To me, this suggests that the populace of Kier is completely devastated. This may also explain the cultural dissonance when comparing reality to the show. We know that the show takes place during the 21st century, but a lot of the cultural aspects of the show seem to be from the mid-20th century instead. If humanity fell apart and was brought back, who knows what we'd lose? And if Lumen was the ones to bring it back, their style of life would be what influences everything else. This might be what O&D is actually doing. They're sending things off to create a veneer of quantity and surplus. The misunderstanding of World War I really early on would make a lot more sense, since if it was something like the Punic Wars, which happened thousands of years ago, people would be a lot easier forgiven for it. But what if World War I did happen thousands of years ago here? Then a simple naming mistake would be a lot less weird. Lastly, for this part of the theory, at least one of these three characters should have a firearm if there isn't any major cultural differences, so the fact that they don't mean there are. Now, there are a few reasons why I would pick an ecological disaster over other apocalypse options. When Mark is reading about Gans, there's a small article about a coyote resurgence in the area, which would fit with the devastated populace stuff we talked about earlier. In the street scene where Mark and Alexa are talking about their lives, Alexa implies that Pennsylvania is a lot colder than Montana, even though that is not even close to being the case in reality. There's this really minor quote, and it could just be Rickon being Rickon, about how he mentions funny bees, which could be something, but it's also Rickon, so you don't really know. For the last of the quotes, there's this Cure quote.
And I shall whisper to ye, dutiful through the ages. In your noblest thoughts and epiphanies shall be my voice. You are my mouth, and through ye I will whisper on when I am 10 centuries demised.
That could already be true, which would be funny and also kind of depressing. There's also this painting of lakes with presumably Kier looking out upon them, but to me these look almost identical to the Great Lakes in everything but scale and some shape. So the fact that they're kind of not, but they kind of are, fits with the cultural dissonance stuff, and also would fit with an ecological disaster, because then you wouldn't know what they looked like. This is probably the most depressing theory out of the four, because if it ended up being even a little true, Lumen would be so powerful that it would be a true dystopia, and it's very unlikely a few plucky rebels would be able to overturn them. So that would suck. Part of what I like about this theory in particular is you don't know how many times something like this could happen, because the entire show is about forgetting, and this is something that kind of just makes the entire world forget, so it could happen multiple times, like an abstract amount, like truly you don't know, like the sun might burn out soon and they don't even know it. Even though the amount of time I spent on the last two theories is a lot longer than the first two, I don't think they're as likely as the first two, because there's a certain simplicity in the first two that makes them more likely, whereas these last two I really like, but they're kind of weird, like I've said before, and that might be why they're not the case. To me, the Apocalypse one is the one I like the most because it feels pretty novel, and also it would be very different than what almost anyone's predicting right now, and that would be nice. Also, if Kier's wife and her death are revealed at all, that makes the third theory way more likely. If Kier's an alcoholic, that makes the third theory way more likely. If Mark was seriously sick as a child, it's way more likely. As a secret treat for getting to the end of the video, I actually have a fifth theory that has no plot relevance at all, and it's that Once in a Lifetime by the Talking Heads will appear in this show at least once. I'm not going to explain it, but if you think about it, it makes sense. Alright, that's it.